Greetings, anonymous party members, and greetings also to those of you who are looking into the party. This is my 7th video, and in it I will be discussing the basics of my plan for reforming the welfare system. I will also be covering a small portion of my plan to save the Social Security retirement program. The portion of that plan, at least, that overlaps with the welfare reform. You'll see why when I get there. But I do think it's important to note that by principle, I don't really think that we ever should have instituted a welfare system in the United States. Welfare spending is a significant portion of our budget, and without it, I don't think that we would have a deficit. I might be wrong on that, so don't hold me to it. But certainly, it would be greatly reduced without it at any rate. But I like to think I'm a practical-minded person, so I also know that this is obviously not something that can just be shut off overnight, nor is it likely anything that will ever be shut off completely. So if we're going to keep it, we might as well run it in a way that it can at least be sustainable and not an excessive burden to the rest of the people in the country that are paying taxes and are not recipients of that welfare. That being said, though, I'll summarize the entire plan by saying that the earliest primary targets for reform should be in the area of fraud prevention, followed by program consolidation, and then restructuring of how guidelines and limits should work. All three of these basic parts could be going on at the same time, and probably at least should for the entire thing to work ideally. But that's the extreme basics, but that doesn't really tell you exactly how I plan to accomplish these three target goals. So I'll go into a little more detail, starting with fraud prevention. First off, even kind of where this overlaps a little bit, it's worth mentioning that combining and streamlining the existing programs and condensing them down to the least necessary number of programs will aid in reducing the welfare fraud, because a person would need multiple identities to collect as much money under that system. But more importantly, and perhaps more effective in the fraud prevention area, is my fraud report and rewards program. The concept of this is fairly simple. Rather than wasting money on drug screenings for welfare candidates, which can be fooled or circumvented in some ways anyhow, and some people argue that drug screenings are a violation of Fourth Amendment rights. That's an entirely different debate with valid points on both sides, but I say we just skip that whole argument and instead create a small call center where people can report instances of fraud. If fraud is found and stopped as a result of the information provided, then the person who provided that information would receive a reward equal to 1/10 of the amount that would have been lost due to the fraud for the remainder of the time that the fraud would have endured, or 1 year, whichever is greater. Or, whichever is less. Up to 1 year, or if less than a year, whatever it was. The person committing the fraud would also be required to pay a fine equal to twice that same amount, or possibly more, depending on how long they had been succeeding in committing the fraud and how much their assets totaled. The money collected from that fee would be used to pay the reward and to pay legal fees associated with prosecuting that case, and also any remainders would help to fund the call center that would be set up for receiving those fraud reports. I do fully realize, though, that this may result in people reporting excessively in the hopes that at least some of their reports would result in a reward. This is why I also would institute a false reporting fee. If fraud is reported and there is not at least some shred of evidence to support this accusation, then a fine would be levied against the person who filed the false report. This isn't to say that fraud has to be found, just that there at least has to be some good reason that the person was fooled into thinking that there was fraudulent activity going on. I would also be okay with allowing 1 or 2 warnings per person before fines would be levied, but without that side of this program, I could easily see it becoming overloaded with false claims of fraud. So both sides of that program would definitely be necessary. But this has a secondary benefit as well. Money would be put back into the system, the economy that is, that would have been wasted on fraud. And this now is going instead to promote honesty and a pride in the system. So if people actually have a stake in the success of the system via the rewards, or on the other side of it, the sustainability of the welfare program without being a huge burden to the government, then they're more likely to guard it from fraudulent activities. I think the reward part of that probably has more of an effect, but the next area was the consolidation of programs. Like I said, this would help to reduce fraud, since the fewer programs that someone can apply to, the fewer different ways that they can be stealing money, essentially, from the government or their fellow taxpayers, whichever way you want to look at it. But currently there are hundreds of welfare programs out there. The most popular of which most people will recognize being TANF, also known as food stamps, Medicaid, WIC, and various housing subsidies. There are also hundreds of lesser-known ones for various purposes, such as helping poor families insulate their older homes, one that I would qualify for. But it's actually worth it for me to spend that money myself, so I'm not going to make other taxpayers subsidize a good choice that I should be making myself anyways. Another one, providing care and food for the pets of underprivileged families. I'm not 100% sure that one actually ever made it, but it was proposed, and has to be one of the most ridiculous ideas I think I've ever heard. But a few of these really should be trimmed off as quickly as possible, and in all fairness though, on the topic of the one with providing care and food for pets of underprivileged families, if you can't afford your own food, and your fellow citizens, your neighbors, other taxpayers are essentially buying your food for you, is it really fair to make them buy food for your dog as well? If you can't afford your own food, you shouldn't have a dog. I'm not trying to be mean, and it probably sounds mean, but pets are not a necessity. They're a luxury. They're a responsibility, but they're not a necessity. It's a responsibility that you should only take on if you can afford to. Now, I fully understand that situations can change. I've been victim to that myself. But sometimes you have to take finances in consideration on whether to keep a pet. It's not always an easy choice, but it's sometimes one that absolutely needs to be done. As for the other programs, many of these, especially in the area of housing, they overlap a lot. By combining a lot of these programs together and allowing only one program to cover housing, only one to cover food, and only one to cover healthcare, then the possibilities for fraud are drastically reduced. Possibly more importantly, though, the number of government workers required to provide or distribute this aid is reduced, which will also reduce the cost to taxpayers, even if the actual benefits paid out to welfare recipients is not reduced by a single dollar. Now, I do also realize that that will result in a reduction of employed people in the country. But anytime the government saves money, especially if they're also able to reduce taxes, that enables job growth outside of government. And that's really where the job growth should be occurring anyways, because job growth inside of government is just more of a burden on those who still work outside of government. Important to note, though, I do like some aspects of the WIC program. I also kind of see its flaws. It encourages waste at the consumer level. Many participants use the vouchers to buy the items on them, even when they don't need them or even want them, just because in their eyes it looks like it's going to waste if they don't use it, even though the opposite is actually true. If they won't use it, they wouldn't be wasting taxpayer dollars by just not getting the items, because the wicks are paid for as they're used, not as they're issued. It's not a check to the grocery store for X amount of dollars, and then if you don't get it, then the grocery store gets extra money. And even if that were the case, does it really matter? Many of them will get an extra gallon of milk or a gallon of juice, box of cereal, or whatever, and then just never use it, throw it away, or in some of the better cases, give it to a food bank or another friend that might need it, but not actually either qualify or be willing to go and get it from the welfare program. And while I do like the aspect that it encourages healthier food purchases, it also favors approved brands, instead of allowing customers or consumers to choose which brands they think are the healthiest choices for themselves. This means government is picking winners and losers, which the government has no business picking winners and losers in the marketplace. They should not be picking who gets money and who doesn't get money. They shouldn't be picking where customers spend their money, where they don't spend their money, or what they're spending money on, or what they're not spending money on. And while it does bug me to see people spending food stamps on junk food, it also bugs me to see the government deciding who gets the money and who doesn't. So where do we draw the line? Personally, I'd support changing the guidelines on food stamps to disallow the purchases of candy and pop, but I'd also be in favor of allowing basic necessary commodities such as toilet paper, facial tissues, and things such as trash bags. But I'm open to debate on this issue. I don't have a real extremely solid position on exactly where that line should be drawn, but as far as the Medicaid issue goes, though, there's a ton of fraud in this category, and most of it isn't at the level of the poor people who are receiving it. Most of it. Most of the fraud here is actually on behalf of doctors, hospitals, or medical practices of some sort or another that are filing false claims, either using social security numbers for actual customers, just making extra claims and then just never actually sending a bill to these people, or making up social security numbers, making up people, making up events, all sorts of things. There is a ton of fraud in here, and the system, because of fraud, is, some people have estimated it costs twice as much as it should just because of fraud. And my hopes are that the fraud reporting and reward program would solve the vast majority of that, in that some doctors that were participating in the fraudulent claims would cease that in the fear that someone would turn them in, or that a lot of people would be looking a lot more closely at what these doctors are doing, and anytime a doctor's anytime they see anything suspicious from a particular doctor, they would provide that information to the fraud reporting hotline, because they know that if that fraud is investigated and that doctor is found to be defrauding the welfare or the Medicare or Medicaid program of $1 million a year, they would get a check for $100,000. And if my system was in place and I found that fraud, if somebody else implemented my system and I found that fraud, I would be ecstatic. I would turn that guy in a heartbeat. You wouldn't get away with much, because if you've got a nurse, if you've got somebody, you'd have to pay them a lot. You'd have to give them a huge share of that to participate in that with you, or else they're just going to turn you in. So, but my hope is that my system would solve the vast majority of that. But I'm realistic, and I know that no system can prevent all of it, but I do think that my system would drastically reduce it. The same area of the medical care is where Social Security is involved. One of the big reasons that Social Security is failing is because of the disability portion of the program. Originally, Social Security was intended, and it was supposed to be, a retirement program. But somewhere along the line, they decided that they would start paying out for those who were disabled as well. At first, it was only for severely disabled people, and didn't put much of a dent in the program, but as is the case with anything, once the doors open, it'll always open wider. And soon, all the money was draining out this side door. And, well, disability isn't the same thing as retiring, as anyone can clearly tell. So I think stricter guidelines need to be in place within the disability program as well. A lot of people have pointed that out. There are certainly people who are on disability who aren't really disabled, or at least not disabled enough to where they can't go get a job, even a halfway decent one. But almost as importantly as that, I think it needs to be removed entirely from Social Security. There shouldn't be a Social Security disability. There should be a disability welfare program. So move that entire thing over to the welfare thing and attach that to the welfare department, the welfare bureau, or whatever it is that all the other programs are consolidated into. But once it's separated, it would no longer be able to cripple the retirement plan. Why should we allow it to cripple a retirement plan when no other private retirement plan on earth, to my knowledge at least, allows anyone to withdraw more than they put in for the rest of their life just because their back doesn't work right, or they can't use one of their hands, or any other number of things. I'm not ragging on disabled people, just pointing out that becoming disabled is not the same as retiring. Not according to any plan other than, for some odd reason, our Social Security. Also, though, by including it in the welfare category, any fraud attempted within it can thusly be investigated by the same fraud prevention program I described earlier. My last point, and possibly my favorite though, is the current system actually encourages dependence on the system and traps people in it. How so, you may ask? Well, here's where we get into some scenarios. Let's just say, for example, that under the current food stamp guidelines, you are allowed to make up to $500 a month. If you make more than $500 a month, you lose your food stamps benefits. So, if you have a part-time job at which you make $450 a month, and you receive $500 a month in food stamps, your total amount of income for that month is $950. 500 in food stamps, $450 from your job, $950. If your job sees that you're doing a good job, which hopefully you are, and they decide to give you a raise, this raise brings you up to, let's say, $525 a month. Logic would normally tell you, yay, a raise, I'm making more money now. But not if you're on food stamps, at least not with the limits that are in my example. $520 puts you $25 over their maximum limit, and you would then lose your food stamps, and your total income now is only $525, which means rather than a $75 raise, they've just bumped your pay up to $425 less than you were taking home before. So, it would in this case be in your best interest to either turn down that raise, because it actually loses you money, or to have your hours cut so that you're still making less than $500 a month. This is what I like to call a barricade to success. In order for you to take home more money than you can under that system, you would essentially have to more than double your income from your job to compensate for your lack of food stamps, or your loss of food stamps. Very few people are able to achieve this kind of jump. It does happen, but it's not common at all. And for those people who want to get out of food stamps, this makes it extremely, extremely difficult. So, I think the program should be structured entirely differently. Rather than set a benefit amount coupled with a threshold, I would propose more of a graduated scale. For instance, if you make less than $400, you qualify for the full amount of $500 in food stamps benefits, which, if you made $400 even, would total $900. For every $2 that you make beyond $400, you would lose $1 of food stamps benefits. So, going back to our earlier scenario, you're making $450 a month. So, this would net you $450 minus the $400 minimum divided by 2 would equal $25. $450 minus 400 is 50, divided by 2 equals 25. You subtract that $25 from the maximum benefit of $500, which would leave $475. Add that to the $450 you earned at your job, $450 from your job, $475 from food stamps, and you got $925. Now, under the other system, you're taking home $950. So, I mean, in this particular case, you're taking home ever so slightly less, but your situation is still improved, at least in the slightly longer run, because now you have the option to get more hours at work if your work will let you. You also have the option to take a different job that pays ever so slightly more. You have the option to accept a raise if they decide to give you one. There's all kinds of options now. But if you did get that raise to $525 a month, now your new amount would be the $525 minus 400 gives you $125 beyond the $400 threshold for the maximum benefit. You divide the 125 by 2, it gives you $62.50. That is the amount subtracted from the total benefit amount of $500. This equals $437.50. That is now what you would get in food stamps for that month. Add that to your $525, and your new total is $962.50, which is $12.50 more than what you were making under the old system. So you're still improved, but you got a $75 a month raise, and you're taking home $37.50 more than you were taking home before. You're still making more money. No matter how much more money you're making, you're always taking home more money. That's the beauty of this program. So let's say you get another raise, and now you're making $600 a month. Now your total amount with food stamps and income is $1,000. And your food stamps don't disappear entirely until you hit $1,400 in a month. Granted, as you're approaching the $1,400 mark, your food stamps become so kind of, insignificant. I mean, if you're making $13.90 a month, then your food stamp amount would only be $5. At that point, I see a lot of people probably just not even bothering to go to the food stamp office to turn in their paperwork to get that. Some might, some might not. But no matter where you are on the scale, though, you will have more money at the end of the month that you get to spend on whatever it is that you need to spend money on, regardless of where you're at on that scale. Keep in mind, though, that these are just example calculations. I'm aware that most people's expenses, I know mine are significantly higher than the figures I provided, and that's not where the actual limits are going to be, at least probably not in most areas, if it's even close in any. Research and analysis obviously would have to be done to determine where the precise limits should be, and they would most likely be different in different areas. But the basics of the system will still have to be used in calculating that. But the single basic principle in this is that you only lose half as much in benefits as what you earn beyond a certain limit. You always take home more money when you earn more money. But the key to this is that I've seen so many people turn down raises because they didn't want to lose their welfare. I've seen people accept raises but then have to cut hours just to stay below a certain level. I remember when I was a kid, probably around 10 or 11 years old, my mom had to turn down a raise or cut hours. I don't remember exactly which one it was, but she had to do that in order to continue getting food stamps. But why should people be encouraged to work less or to earn less shouldn't they be enabled to escape the welfare system? Especially if they want to. I mean, not everybody that's on welfare is motivated to get off of it, and I see that as one of its problems. But especially for those who want to get off of welfare, why should we trap them there? That's a burden to the taxpayers that the government has essentially created a trap to hold people into. It's unfair to the people who want to get out of it, especially, to make it a trap that keeps them there. So the fact that the system is engineered to operate this way is evidence that some politicians in some way benefit, or are at least convinced that they benefit, from having people stuck on welfare. This should never be the case. While I can see the possibility that a larger number of people may receive benefits under this system, my system, because the limits would be a little higher, even though they'd be getting less, I also foresee at least a small decrease in the total amount distributed in the short term. Those who were holding back on hours could suddenly afford to be able to work more. Those who had to turn down raises can now accept them if they're still able to. And businesses will also benefit as well, because now they will be able to use the people that they have more, rather than to have to hire and train more people to do the same jobs. Training is expensive, and any company will tell you that training employees and turnover are some of the largest costs to their labor end of things. It's a major drain on their spending. So by being able to use the same people to do more of the same job, they will benefit. And some of you I know are against businesses benefiting from that kind of stuff, but that's all businesses, not just the big ones. That statement, though, might sound like a reduction of jobs, in that they don't have to hire more people, but it's a reduction in part-time jobs, or at least a reduction in the number of part-time jobs, even if they're not cutting part-time jobs or moving more into full-time. They're able to take people who were only able to work, say 12, 13, 14 hours a week, and then bump them up to 20, 25 even maybe. So even if there's no reduction in part-time jobs, they won't need to create more extremely low-hour part-time jobs. But we don't need more part-time jobs in this country right now. Obamacare effectively created far more than I think we've ever had at any time in the history of our country, and especially more part-time jobs as a comparison to full-time jobs. We need more full-time jobs. They're better for everyone, employers and workers alike, especially if government regulation does not destroy that benefit somehow, like Obamacare. I don't want to say that Obamacare destroys it entirely by itself, but it certainly assists if it doesn't do it by itself. But so this is the basics of my plan. Like I said, though, there's a lot of details to flesh out. How to combine the programs and departments, where to set the limits, how exactly the report and reward program will function. I don't have every single detail of any of these portions laid out, but I am only one man, and at the moment, I'm the one seeing the big picture, not all the tiny details. Hopefully this makes perfect sense to anyone watching now, even those of you who are on some type of assistance. I assure you that even if you don't benefit in some way immediately, hopefully you can see that this is in your best interest, especially if you want to get out of welfare and earn more money. But I assure you that under my plan, no one would be permanently worse off other than those whose goal it is to cheat the system. These are the only true bad guys. The rest are either unfortunate or ignorant, or in some cases both. Now, ignorant often sounds like an insult, and I suppose it can be taken that way, but I definitely don't like to say stupid, because ignorance can be corrected with information. Stupid those are the people who ignore the information. But both types of these people, both the unfortunate and the ignorant, can be aided in a much better fashion than what is being done now. So, until next time, I wish you all the best. And please remember, if you haven't already, sign up for the forums on the website. The address is www.anonymousparty.org, and vote for the topic you'd like me to work on next. This is the first topic that I've done that was voted on by the people. There weren't a whole lot of votes. Hopefully the next one will have more. But also, feel free to share your thoughts, your opinions, and your ideas. They matter because we are the reason that the government is there. We are the purpose to which they are supposed to serve. Government representatives are supposed to be there to serve you because you are the people.